Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 93. Nothing's New. All Might was acting strange when he picked him up. Izuku weakly tried to initiate conversation a few times, but he just replied in one or two words, and eventually he stopped trying. Was he disappointed in him? Did he see the results already? Kami, was he watching the whole time? As the drive went on in painful silence, Izuku became more and more convinced that he had failed spectacularly. All Might didn't ask him how the test went, so he must already know. Damn. Kami, he was so useless. He wasted at least the last fifth of the exam, quote, saving someone in the most idiotic way imaginable for no reason. UA wouldn't have let a student die in the exams, and he could have just used One for All to move the debris trapping her. The robot wasn't that close, was it? There was probably enough time, and he was just too hopped up on adrenaline to see it. He dragged that other boy down with him, too. He didn't feel as bad about that last part as he probably should have, though. That guy was obnoxious. He hoped he still got enough points, though. Just because he was annoying doesn't mean he deserved to get his dreams ruined by an idiot meddling somewhere that didn't need meddling. Getting dropped off at his old apartment building was the cherry on top of his day. He bid All Might goodbye and tried not to take his forced smile to heart as he watched him drive away from his hiding place in the lobby. 10 months of training with Japan's #1 hero and being gifted one of the strongest quirks the world has ever seen wasn't enough to save him. He was doomed from the start. He never had a chance. He'd accepted that. Why did he always let hope drag him back into its clutches? He did it with Kachan over and over when he first got diagnosed as quirkless. For years, he'd get up and hope today he'd be good enough to be his friend again, but he never was. He did it with his mother over and over after his dad left. For years, he'd get up and hope today she would love him enough to cook dinner or smile at him, to tell him he was worth a damn, but she never did. He did it with his staircase and DJ and the Shinsos. It took him over a year and a half to finally give in to hope that time, and right when he did, it was all ripped away. Why did he keep falling for it every single damn time? Was he really that stupid? None of this was new. It was the same thing over and over and over and over. Nothing's new. Nothing's new. Why the hell did he think he could be? He didn't even know where his feet were taking him. The sun had set and he knew he should go home, but he didn't care. He didn't have room to care about anything right now. His mind was filled with rage and grief and an all too familiar, overwhelming, suffocating hopelessness. The logical part of his brain tried to tell him that the entrance exam for Shiketsu was in a few weeks' time. It tried to tell him that UA wasn't his only option, that this failure wasn't the end of the world, but that voice was so quiet in the torrent of his thoughts. It was too quiet to be heard over the wind roaring around him. Oh, he was on a roof. Why was he always on a roof? The lights of Mustafa twinkled to the west, and he could almost fool himself into thinking he could hear the waves crashing against the shore in the east. It was beautiful, and he was sitting on the ledge. Why was he always on the ledge? There was a fire escape beneath him, so he wasn't in immediate peril should he fall, but the sentiment remained the same. Even his subconscious was trying to make him get the hint. This was stupid. He was being childish. His life wasn't his to play around with anymore. As long as he held One for All, taking a swan dive was a luxury that he couldn't afford. It was selfish to even consider it. He needed to pull himself together and go home. His arm hurt in a way that told him he'd used it to climb up here, and he let the pain ground him. The cold wind stung his face the longer he sat up there, and he just let it. He sat there until he knew his cheeks would be rosy for days from the windburn before he finally forced himself back down the fire escape. He let muscle memory take him back to the brewery and paid less attention than he probably should to his surroundings to make sure that no one was following him. But he figured if a rat scuttling across an alley on the other side of the street was enough to ping his radar, then he should be fine. He really thought he had a shot at this. He really thought he could do it. He was delusional. UA's acceptance rate was lower than 1%. What the hell was he thinking? Sure, he had All Might's quirk, but he couldn't even use 5% of it without self-destructing. He couldn't do anything without self-destructing, though, so he shouldn't be so pressed about it. Izuku was tired. So tired. When he got back to his little office, he let his bag fall to the floor and threw himself face first into the couch, broken arm pinned awkwardly beneath him. The angle gave him a twinge of pain, but he ignored it. He was used to the feeling of broken bones scraping against each other under his skin by this point. The ache only grew the longer he laid there, and he only moved when it became borderline unbearable. He didn't want to give Recovery Girl more work and make her set his arm again. He rolled onto his back and tried not to think about his little revelation on the roof, but after nearly 4 hours of staring at the ceiling and fighting the urge to tear his own hair out, he was forced to admit to himself that the option of ending it all had provided him far more comfort than he thought. It was a lot easier to face his problems when he knew he had the option to quit. Now that he didn't have that, he didn't know what to do. What if he couldn't take it anymore? What then? What was he supposed to do? What was he supposed to do right now? He found himself digging his fingernails into the palm of his good hand, and the pain was comforting. He wasn't stupid. He knew that wasn't a road he should go down. It wasn't an urge that he should tempt. But what else was there? As he watched the clock on his radio tick over to 1 a.m., he decided enough was enough. He couldn't just keep laying here. He threw his blanket off and let his feet take him where they always did, the roof. His makeshift bucket garden held nothing but shriveled up tomato vines, and he thought distantly that he should probably not relate so much to a dead plant. As he looked over the sea of abandoned warehouses, he thought about why this was so difficult for him. Not just his failure, but his realization. He rarely ever seriously considered suicide, only a handful of times in the last few years. And he was doing better now anyway. He didn't really want to die, so why was no longer having that option keeping him up? Maybe it was some sort of Stockholm syndrome, or maybe it was the lack of choice in and of itself. He was stuck here now. That was it. The one bit of control he had had over his life was gone. Everything he held dear to him was one exposed secret, one slip up away from being ripped from his grasp, and ending it all was the only thing no one could take from him. But now it was gone. Kami, that was so screwed up. Most kids had a stuffed animal or something to comfort them, and all he had was suicidal ideation? Sheesh, what was he supposed to do with that information? Some things were better left alone. He should have walked to the convenience store and nicked some sleeping pills to knock himself out. Ruminating on his problems never fixed them. There were some things about himself that he just didn't need to know. He eventually managed to get a few hours of sleep. Recovery girl would probably reprimand him if she knew, but honestly, it wasn't much less sleep than he normally got. He woke up tired, with a familiar hollow weight in his chest, one that told him to stay in bed, one that told him that whatever waited for him today wasn't worth it. The dramatic melancholy was just annoying at this point. He had to get up. He didn't have a choice. He had to get his arm fixed today, and he had to go to the library on the other side of town to register for Shiketsu's entrance exam, and he may as well register for Ketsubutsu or whatever other school's exams haven't passed already. Izuku almost laughed at himself. Was he really so confident about UA that he didn't register for anywhere else? He told All Might that his mother was going to drive him to his appointment with Recovery Girl and took the train. He couldn't face his mentor right now. Recovery Girl didn't question his foul mood, and he was grateful for that. She just gave him an encouraging smile and an extra handful of sweets before sending him on his way. Sunday passed in a painfully slow sloth, one that he hadn't felt since he started training with All Might. His mind was at war with itself, half of it lost to pointless self-pity, and the other half trying desperately to move on and let the past be the past. The opposing sides left him in a state of paralysis where each second ticked by with excruciating clarity. He did everything that needed doing and tried his best to eat enough food to be considered a meal, but fell desperately short before spending the rest of the day laying on the couch in the dark. Things would be better tomorrow. He had patrol. That would take his mind off things at least. Monday didn't fare much better than the day prior, but he muddled through. He had patrol tonight. Moving around and getting some fresh air would be good for him. Hopefully, it would at least tire him out enough to sleep soundly. He looked at himself in his broken mirror as he applied the dark eyeshadow around his eyes. He looked awful. Come on, Izuku. Patrol's gonna fix everything, he muttered to himself. Being delusional was better than being depressed. Nothing was going to get better if he didn't think it would get better. He knew that, so he plastered on his Ivy persona and pretended everything was fine. Eraser looked different, and it took them a little longer than they'd like to admit to realize that it was because he hadn't shaved. His usual stubble was a day away from being a full-on beard. He looked haggard. New look or having a crisis. They poked, though they were genuinely concerned that it was the latter. Crisis, Eraser responded. His tone was as deadpan as ever, but Izuku could still tell he was joking somehow. I was hoping that was the case. It's not a good look on you, they jabbed again. Charming as ever, Ivy. It's a gift, they responded with faux gratitude. Why are we having a crisis exactly? Work. Entrance exams were Saturday, and there's a lot more that needs to be reviewed than there usually is. Oh, for goodness sake, the entrance exams were the last thing they wanted to think about. They'd been looking forward to patrol so that they could think about anything besides the entrance exams. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? They asked, because it would be weird to not respond. Both. Mostly good, though. Well, good for the students, not good for us. Just more work for you. Yep, Eraser replied, somehow managing to unenthusiastically pop the P at the end. Overall, a promising batch, though. Promising to be a pain in my ass, at least. You gonna expel the whole class again? They joked. I'd prefer not to. That was such a nightmare to deal with, and I was serious about this batch having potential. There's so much review to do because extra points are being awarded, he clarified. Awarding extra points? For what? Could he? No! Just No, he could not bear to hope any more. He couldn't take it being ripped away again. Gosh, he couldn't take it anymore. Even still, he felt its warmth seeping through the cracks. He would never be free of it. Hope was such a wretched thing. You okay, kid? Eraser's voice cut through his thoughts. Yeah, I'm fine, just spaced out there for a second. What'd you say? They lied, pretending that their mini crisis had nothing to do with what Eraser had just said. Nothing important, just work shit. You sure you're all right? You went all 1,000-yard stare there for a second, he asked again as he started eating his dinner. Yeah, I'm fine. Just lost in work shit, too, they replied. That explains your 5 o'clock shadow, Eraser quipped with a self-satisfied smirk. Hey, for all you know, I have a luscious beard that this mask can barely contain, they shot back, easily falling into their well-worn banter. I'll believe it when I see it, he replied lazily with a mouth full of rice. It felt better to be Ivy. It felt better to not be so alone. But the night passed regardless of his wishes, and eventually he was Izuku again. He didn't want to be Izuku anymore. He was glad to have stacked both break days for the week right after the exam. He didn't want to know how much worse he would be doing if he hadn't had something to distract himself through the worst of his little episode. As it stands, he was filing his nails down obsessively because the temptation to dig them into his palms had been too great to ignore. All Might had told him that he had, quote, earned a break from training last Tuesday, and Izuku wasn't sure what to make of that. Did he just not want to see him? Had he given up on him? He had gone to the Ketsubutsu exam last weekend, and he thought he did pretty well there. But that didn't make him feel any better. The fact that it didn't make him feel any better just compounded his misery because how arrogant was he that the possibility of getting into Ketsubutsu wasn't enough for him. He was such a child, having a breakdown because he didn't get his way. UA was a pipe dream and he needed to move on. Shiketsu's exam was this Saturday, which was also when UA's exam results were due to be sent out. All Might hadn't been speaking to him much in the last 2 weeks. They didn't usually text often, but the damn near radio silence after seeing him 5 days a week for the last 10 months was jarring. It was lonely. He'd texted him a picture of his garden box all tilled up and ready for the coming season, and Izuku wanted to respond and tell him that he thought he'd done well on the Ketsubutsu exam, but he didn't have the nerve. The Shiketsu exam didn't go as well as he felt that the Ketsubutsu exam had gone, but he thinks, or at least he hoped, he did a passable job. His train brought him back to Mustafu with enough time to check his P.O. box if he hurried. He didn't want to hurry. He didn't want to see what waited for him. But like most things he did lately, he forced himself to anyway. The bell above the door chimed as he walked in just a few minutes before the post office was due to close, and the middle-aged man at the desk looked like he was praying Izuku wouldn't go up and talk to him. He gave him a polite nod as he made his way over to his box at the front end of the shop. A crisp white envelope with shiny red wax seal greeted him when he turned the key and peered inside. He didn't want to grab it. He didn't even want to look at it. But the clerk at the counter was eyeing him, likely waiting for him to leave so that he could close down shop for the night. So Izuku grabbed the letter and stuffed it in his bag before he could think too much about it. He knew he could lose himself staring off into nothing for hours, and he didn't want to have to put the poor underpaid clerk through his mental breakdown. Just as he had thought, the clerk followed him out and flipped the sign over after the door shut behind him. The sun was low in the sky, casting a golden light over the pavement, and the air was pleasantly cool. The last of the biting winter winds having faded for the season, It was a beautiful evening to get his dreams crushed. He took his time walking back home. The air was pleasant, and the letter that waited him surely wasn't. He wanted to live in denial for just a little longer. As much as he had been beating himself up for his failure the last 2 weeks, the barest hint of hope still remained, and would remain until he opened that letter. His long walk eventually came to an end, and he found himself at his desk, staring at the envelope like it had already wronged him. The sunlight coming through the window behind him shone like a rectangular spotlight on the desk dramatically. The realization made him scoff, as if whatever news contained in that envelope could be the light at the end of the tunnel. No, he knew what awaited him, and no matter how long he stared at it, it would not change the outcome. Biting the bullet, he carefully peeled the wax seal and shook out the envelope's contents. A small disc fell out and fell onto the table. "I am here as a projection!" All Might's voice boomed from the disc's tiny speaker, causing Izuku to damn near jump out of his skin. "I know it's been a while, but with great power comes a great amount of paperwork. My apologies, young man. The truth is, I didn't come to this city just to fight villains. You're looking at the newest UA faculty member." That explained a lot. He wasn't too surprised by that. "You passed the written test with flying colors, scoring in the 99th percentile. Well done, young man." He what? He thought he'd done all right on that part, but the top 1% of applicants? He'd never scored that high on something in his life. As for the practical exam, oh, Kami, here it comes. You scored 34 villain points. Yeah, he knew that. He knew all of this. He didn't want to have to hear his mentor repeat it all. Just enough to secure your place in UA's hero course. What? All Might kept talking, but he didn't hear a word of it. He numbly slapped a hand over the projection disc, managing to pause it somewhere around his fourth blind spot. He didn't hear that right. He couldn't have heard that right. There was no way. There was just no way. He was shaking, and he wasn't sure how long he sat there frozen, staring at the stilled projection of his mentor. He had to have heard that wrong. He didn't use One for All to get any points. There's no way he got into the hero course like that. There's no way he got in quirkless. He figured out how to rewind the tape with his fumbling hands, but All Might kept saying the same thing. There had to be a catch. After Kami knows how many times of listening to that, he let it continue to play. There had to be a catch. You scored 34 villain points, just enough to secure your place in UA's hero course. But that's not all. You went above and beyond the call of duty and risked not only your score, but your well-being to save another participant. How could the hero course overlook such a heroic act? For your selfless efforts, you have been awarded 60 rescue points. What? He paused the recording again. There was no way they gave him 60 points for that moronic display. There was no freaking way. Again, he rewound the tape, and again, All Might kept saying the same nonsense over and over. There were only a few seconds left on the recording. That was enough time to say, psych! Surely he was going to take it all back. For your selfless efforts, you've been awarded 60 rescue points. In total, you received 94 points on the practical exam, bringing you to the top of the pack by a significant margin. This is the highest score UA has seen in decades. Congratulations, young Midoriya. Welcome to your Hero Academia. All Might concluded with one of his trademark smiles before the projection flipped out. What? 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 The sun's light had completely left the sky, and night had blanketed the city before he was able to think anything beyond that simple four-letter word. He turned on his light and read through the letter that had accompanied the projection disc, but it only confirmed what the recording had said, along with further instructions on where and how to get a uniform and a bunch of paperwork that he had to fill out. He must have read the letter over 50 times, yet the words remained the same. He made it into UA. He made it into UA quirkless. How could he could have done it? He really could have done it. He could have been the first. No, 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 no. That was delusional. He was a null before. He was different now. He was fundamentally different down to his very DNA. That had to be it, right? Maybe One for All had passive benefits. Maybe it made him smarter or something. He kept trying to come up with excuses in his head, but each one was weaker than the last. By the time his alarm went off, letting him know it was time to get ready for patrol, he had intellectually accepted it. He could have gotten into UA quirkless. They were wrong. Everyone who had told him he couldn't do it was wrong. Everyone who called him weak was wrong. It should have been liberating, vindicating, exhilarating, but it just made him numb. The hollow weight that had made its home in his chest writhed and screamed like a wounded animal, and Izuku silenced it accordingly. He had learned from his mistakes. It didn't do him any good to dwell on his emotions. So he tied a short leash around the neck of the ugly creature that felt like it was trying to burst out of his rib cage, walked away, and shut the door behind him. He pretended like he didn't hear it howl. He pretended that he didn't hear it throw itself against the door with a fevered desperation to be seen. He pretended like he didn't hear it begging for its pain to be acknowledged. He locked the door, let a mask of indifference slide over his face, and pretended everything was all right. He had a job to do, one that didn't involve childish tantrums. When he smudged the dark makeup around his eyes in the shattered mirror, he did not recognize the person who looked back at him. There was some suppressed part of himself that knew that wasn't good, but they ignored it. They were rarely ever good. No matter what happened, no matter if things were going their way or not, they were never good. That wasn't new, and the familiarity was comforting in its own convoluted way. None of this was new. Nothing's new. End of chapter.